Undeclared wars are commonplace. Tragically, our government engages in preemptive war, otherwise known as aggression, with no complaints from the American people. Sadly, we have become accustomed to living with the illegitimate use of force by government. To develop a truly free society, the issue of initiating force must be understood and rejected.
What if sometimes, to love your country, you had to alter or abolish the government? What if Jefferson was right? What if that government is best which governs least? What if it is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong? What if it is better to perish fighting for freedom than to live as a slave? What if freedom's greatest hour of danger is now?
Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, February 26th, 2026. Scott Ritter joins us now. Scott, a pleasure. Thank you. You have a fascinating piece out on the Kremlin's view of American foreign policy, and I want to explore that with you at some length. How did the Kremlin view the CIA orchestrated assassination attempt on President Putin using drones to attack his country residents?
Well, surprisingly, you say the Kremlin. The Kremlin actually seems to have an opinion of Donald Trump that he is serious about peace, that he is working to that objective, et cetera, and that there are people in his administration who, may not be supportive of this. People who advise the Kremlin, it appears more and more are thinking that Trump is just leading on the Russians, that this is, a big game designed to drag this process out so that Russia can be weakened from within. There are many who don't trust the 7-point economic, mutual benefit society that Kirill Dmitriev is running around having crafted with Steve Witkoff. So, but the Kremlin seems committed to the spirit of Alaska. I mean, I was just reminded of that yesterday because I'm, hoping to get back to Russia and hoping to, do some interviews and such. And I was put on notice that some people might be uncomfortable talking to me because I've taken such a critical stance on Donald Trump, that in Russia, the spirit of Anchorage, the spirit of Alaska, is something that the government continues to embrace, even though Sergei Lavrov has come out and said that the United States has failed to follow through.
The Russians seem to be under, we'll stick with Alaska for a minute if we could, Scott. The Russians seem to be under the view that there was some sort of a handshake deal between the two presidents. I say handshake because nothing was reduced to writing.
Correct.
And whatever the Russian version of that handshake is, they now believe the Americans did not follow up. Is that a fair analysis that's consistent with your understanding of the Russian view of Anchorage?
That's almost a word-for-word assessment put forward by Sergei Lavrov. Look, shockingly, to be honest, because I'm somebody who has, I remind myself sometimes I'm always feel like I'm in an old, communist, Marxist, Leninist movie. I'm going through a moment of self-criticism, where you review your previous stances and you go, gosh, I might have been a little off on that one. Because I operated under the assumption, I'm still guided by it, that when Vladimir Putin says something, that's the position, especially when it's linked to something as principled as the Russian Constitution. He is a man who, repeatedly talks about, his duty is to the Constitution, to Russia, to the people. And therefore, I would never have believed that Russia would have shaken hands on an agreement that would have frozen the front lines in Kherson and Zaporizhia, while in exchange for receiving the Donbass in totality. But that appears to be the deal that Vladimir Putin shook hands with Donald Trump. And when the Russians say, Sergei Lavrov says, we made extremely painful compromises, because this was, Judge, you remember we talked about this when Keith Kellogg talked about frozen. I said it will never happen. Never happen. The Russians would never agree to freezing. Well, apparently the Russians were looking for a deal, and they believed that Donald Trump was the man who could deliver the deal. And Vladimir Putin told Trump, look, we will agree to a deal. We will agree to the territorial concessions you're talking about. We will freeze the line of contact in Kherson and Zaporizhia, conceding the territory that the Ukrainians currently occupy. But the Donbass in its totality belongs to us. We will never yield on that. And this also implies certain compromises on buffer zones that the Russians have spoken about. The need for buffer zones. So it looks like the Russians made a really big concession on the belief that Donald Trump would follow through. And then immediately, what stunned the Russians is that immediately, instead of calling in the seven dwarves from Europe and reading them the riot act about what the new truth is, he entertained a meeting with Europe and Zelensky and began to take the Russian concession and seek more concessions. The Russians were like, no, that's not how this works. That was the deal. That's what we agreed to. And you're deviating from that. So the Russian position today continues to be that the Spirit of Alaska is the deal that they shook hands with Donald Trump on. I think there's a great deal of disappointment because, for Vladimir Putin to make that deal, that's no small thing. That's a massive concession. And there is a sense of betrayal in Russia that Donald Trump failed to follow through, that the Russians were taking this negotiation process seriously. Everybody was saying the opposite. The Russians aren't taking it seriously. They're trying to drag this thing out. Apparently, the Russians were looking for a deal, and they made the concessions they believed the United States was insisting on for a deal. And then Donald Trump turned around and just started negotiating that away.
Right. How did the Kremlin view the attack on one of its most significant munitions plants by the British missile Flamingo under the guidance of American intel?
There is overwhelming silence coming out of Russia about this. There was initial local reporting that confirmed the strike. I've been in contact with people in Vladkensk who have confirmed the strike. So we know the strike took place. We know the attack happened. But, Judge, the ramifications of this attack are extreme, and nobody wants to acknowledge what this attack meant. The Russians have always been concerned about Ukraine. I try to remind people, and I'll just give a brief history lesson, but the United States has been looking to use Ukraine as a tool to bring down the Soviet Union and Russia since 1948, when the CIA began Operation Red Sox, dropping in, trained paramilitary operatives to organize resistance or join up with the Banderas who were still fighting in an effort to kill a lot of Soviets and to destabilize the Soviet Union. We did that up until 1953, and then we realized that we had been beaten. But then the CIA continued to fund the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists all the way through 1990. And the U.S. Special Forces, there's a plan that's been declassified where the U.S. Special Forces are talking about sending Special Forces teams into Ukraine in case of a war to break Ukraine away from the Soviet Union. We've always been trying to do that, to use Ukraine as a tool. And one of the ways that the Russians feared is if Ukraine became a member of NATO, that we would station long-range strike missile capability on Ukrainian soil. You see, it's a fist right in the stomach of Russia. Look at the map. It's sticking right there. And if you have American missiles right there, we strike deeper into the Soviet or Russian interior than it could be imagined. In places like Votkins, the most important ballistic missile production facility in Russia, bar none, become vulnerable now to attack. This is why the Russians put draft treaties out there in December of 2021 and said, Putin said directly to Biden, you can't put missiles on Ukrainian soil. And the United States refused to endorse that conclusion. Then after the special military operation, the Scalp missile, the Storm Shadow, the American ATACMS were provided. But the Russians said, you can't strike the Russian interior. And when we started talking about that in the fall of 2024, as you recall, we almost went to nuclear war. The Russians said, if you allow ATACMS to strike into the deep, we will hit you back hard. Nuclear weapons are on the table. The CIA believed that, greater than 50% chance of nuclear war. They briefed the United States Congress. We were saved only by then candidate Trump, who said, I won't allow this to happen when I'm president. But then he turns around, talks about giving tomahawks, and the Russians said, if you do that, nukes are on the table. Nukes are on the table. That's how serious this is. So the Flamingo is a workaround. The Flamingo is a missile built by the British using components that could be called Ukrainian, using old aircraft engine that were built in the Motor Siege plant in Zaporizhia. Over 16,000 of these were built over time. Many are still available, can be refurbished. A simple design based upon an old Tupolev 163 drone, but it's been now repurposed to be a strike. German guidance systems, American intelligence going into the German guidance systems. And they have this Flamingo missile. And it flies to 1,400, 1,500 kilometers. It could possibly even go longer. Deep strike capability, similar to the Tomahawk. And now it's being used to strike these targets. If Putin's deal was accepted today, it means that Ukraine, which calls itself the first army of Europe, Europe's shield against Russia, it is identified as a NATO proxy.
Right.
Ukraine would have NATO-linked long-range strike missile capability on its soil. This would be a strategic defeat for Russia. Which is why the Flamingo is now one of these weapon systems that is going to define the outcome of this war, because now with Flamingo, the Russians can't stop the fight.
So
the Russians will have to destroy Ukraine.
Should the Brits expect some major explosions in suburban London where the Flamingo was manufactured?
No, the Flamingo is not it was designed in London, but the Flamingo, Denmark might worry because they have a solid rocket motor plant that's building the booster engine. But the thing about it's designed by the British, but it's intended to be using components that are available to the Ukrainians, can be assembled in Ukraine. So it's like a kit. The different pieces are made throughout Europe, and then they're brought into Ukraine and assembled in Ukraine so they can stamp it made in Ukraine. It's like half the shirts we have here in the United States that say made in the USA, but all the basic materials came elsewhere.
All right. Do you think the Russians will do anything about this?
They have no choice. They've already launched some strikes, but this is bigger than just a simple retaliation. The Flamingo program must be eliminated in its totality, which means that the Ukrainian government must be eliminated. No longer can the Russians accept a ceasefire that allows this current version of Ukraine to continue. Even if Zelensky is removed, which it looks like people are moving, Zaluzhny is the same problem. Budanov is the same problem. Zaluzhny is the former general that the British prefer. Budanov is the former intelligence chief that we prefer. They're the same people. They will continue the Flamingo program, et cetera. The Flamingo cannot be allowed to exist on Ukrainian soil in a post-conflict environment. No long-range strike capability can be allowed to exist, because this creates unthinkable scenarios in time of war. The concept of a preemptive strike to neutralize Russia's command and control or Russia's strategic nuclear deterrence is now real. It doesn't require the United States to launch a preemptive nuclear attack. All it requires is for Ukraine one night to just start firing hundreds, if not thousands, of Flamingos, and the war has begun, and the Russians are at a huge disadvantage. Russia cannot tolerate this. This is why they have said all along, this is long-range missiles on the soil of Ukraine are a showstopper, a red line.
Does this explain the silence of which you spoke a few minutes ago among Russian military and media about the Flamingo attack?
Yes, because this is a huge political problem for the Russians, a huge political problem. And they, to articulate that this is a problem, exposes their current efforts to bring an end to the conflict as weakness, and will open up the government to a criticism. This is my assessment, and as I told you earlier, I'm sometimes wrong, but on this one, again, I'm going off of their past statements. I mean, draft treaties, statements, the whole thing, actions. The current Russian position is there can be no long-range strike capability on Ukrainian soil, none. And now they have it. And so how do you deal with this? I mean, this requires a whole new approach to the Trump administration. But when you start putting demands on the table, nothing happens in a vacuum. So right now you have a deal where you said we've shooken hands, and now you're going to come in and put more, new demands on the United States, because easily say, well, then the deal that we violated, but you want us to adhere to, that's no longer about, we have to start over. And so the Russians have a lot of thinking to do, a lot of contemplating to do, to figure out how to move forward from here. But this was an absolute game-changing moment. The Vodkinsk machine building plant is where the Yars M, their most modern. If you look at the May Day parade, that large mobile missile, they parade down there. That's the Yars. That's their road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile. The Bulava, their version of the Trident missile for our Ohio-class submarines, is produced there. The Oreshnik is produced there. The Iskander missile is produced there. Their follow-on systems, the Cedar missile, is produced there. If they lose Vodkinsk, they lose the ability to produce these missiles, because there is no alternative. There is no place like Vodkinsk in Russia or even the world. It's a unique military industrial facility that's now been shown to be vulnerable to attack by Ukrainian long-range missiles fired from Ukrainian soil.
And Russian defenses couldn't take out the Flamingo midstream?
Well, according to the reports, the Ukrainians fired 6 Flamingos. 5 got shot down. 1 made it through. Russia's a big place, and once you get through the initial screen of missiles, this is where American intelligence comes in, because once you break through that screen, then it's just a matter of maneuvering around the sparsely located missile defense system. So you just maneuver around that, you come in and you hit Vodkinsk. According to some reports, the Russians are now, pouring in air defense right around Vodkinsk to create a ring around Vodkinsk. But you have to ask the question, why didn't you do that earlier? Because they didn't believe the threat existed. Now the threat's real. And so this is going to require a major diversion of Russian resources, of Russian air defense. But the Russians will do it. But Russia, just a little, war story. When we were dropping agents into the Soviet Union, Operation Red Sox, the same problem. We couldn't fly the planes from, say, Germany through Europe to Russia because they had air defense. But we came in through Turkey, up over the Black Sea, and once you crossed in through, over Crimea, or over the Odessa coast, and you penetrated it, there was no air defense, because now you're into the depth. There's no air defense. And we were flying airplanes right up to Moscow and dropping agents off in Moscow, parachuting them all throughout, because there was no air defense to shoot them down. And that's a similar problem that exists today. Once you get into the Russian interior, their air defense is very thinned out.
Wow. Are American jet fighters patrolling the skies over Kyiv, looking to shoot down drones?
Well, we know F-16s are. We've provided F-16s to them. I think what you're saying is, are there American fighters with American pilots? on board.
Yes. When I say yes, I mean that's my question.
Yeah. There's reports that there's a squadron that has been outfitted with NATO trained pilots, Americans and European pilots who have flown the F-16. Some of these Americans have combat experience, and they're flying. But I will just point out, so what? Because where's the AWACS? And because the F-16 is a nice plane, but without AWACS to guide it, direct it, control the battle space, it's just another fighter, an aging fighter, the same kind of fighter. These aren't the modern American fighters. These are the old ones that had already gone past their useful date. You might have a more capable pilot, but it's not going to change anything. And all it's going to do is ensure that Russia does a better job of hunting these people down and killing them. And there are some reports that one of the strikes that hit Ukraine after the Vodkinsk attack included Kinzhal missiles, produced in Vodkinsk, by the way, that hit this very squadron, destroying a number of aircraft and killing a number of those pilots.
Wow. Do you think that during the negotiations, the chief Russian negotiator, I forget his name, is it Medinsky?
Medinsky, yeah.
Right. Looks at Trump's two real estate agents and says, we know you tried to kill President Putin. We know you orchestrated this attack on our top munitions plants. We know you're patrolling the skies of Kyiv. Why should we trust a word you say?
I mean, logically, that's what I would be saying, but that's why I will never be a negotiator, because the negotiator's job isn't to create problems. The negotiator's job is to solve problems. There are other ways for the Russians to send those messages, and those messages have been sent. I remind everybody that when it came to the attempt on Vladimir Putin's life, one of the 91 drones that were targeted, was at least one was captured virtually intact, including its guidance system, and that the major guidance chip was turned over by the head of the Russian military intelligence to the senior defense attaché in Moscow. And that was their way of saying, we know everything. That was the signal, because they're handing in the guidance chip, knowing that if you guys know what's on that, it's intact. You can see yourself. It goes straight to Putin's residence. No this, that, and the other thing. So that's one way to communicate. There's also ongoing contact, back channel contact between the Russian SVR, or Foreign Intelligence Service, and the American CIA. They maintain their channel of communications. So there's other ways to communicate. Medinsky's job isn't to create problems. Medinsky's job is to solve problems. Medinsky operates off a script that has been approved by the Kremlin. And so these communications that you've spoken of will have been done by the Kremlin on other channels. If once you start confronting negotiators, you've ruined the negotiating process for whatever that process is. So, the time to confront Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff isn't during a negotiation. The time to confront them is indirectly, so that before Kushner and Witkoff come to the next round, somebody in the White House has sat them down and said, okay, the Russians are concerned about this, that, and the other thing. This is the approach we should take, et cetera, et cetera.
Last subject matter. Yesterday at the United Nations Security Council, the Russian ambassador to the UN accused France and the United Kingdom of planning to secure parts to nuclear weapons and ship them to Ukraine. What is that all about? Nuclear weapons in the hands of Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a couple things. One, the Ukrainians have long been promulgating the myth of Budapest, which was the agreement in 1994, where Ukraine surrendered physical control of the nuclear weapons that were left in Ukrainian soil by when the collapse of the Soviet Union. They never had operational control. So these were never Ukrainian nuclear weapons. They were just on Ukrainian soil. So Ukraine agreed to return these in totality to Russia, which was deemed to be the sole nuclear power after the Soviet Union fell. Kazakhstan and Belarus also got rid of their nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees. But every legal authority will tell you that the Americans never gave rock solid security guarantees. It was a different workaround. There was no automatic requirement for the United States or anybody to come to the assistance of Ukraine. And the other thing is, it was one big giant grift by the Ukrainians, an extortion. They were supposed to give up these weapons immediately because they said, we don't want them. That was why they signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You don't sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state and then say, oh, no, but we want to keep a nuclear arsenal. They held on to them to get more money from the Russians, who paid them an awful lot of money, and from the United States. Bill Clinton had to pony up money. The United States was so mad at Ukraine for this extortion that there was a lot of bad blood that came out of Budapest. Nobody talks about this. They pretend it was some sort of noble gesture by the Ukrainians. They were just money-grubbing grifters trying to scam everybody for all the money they could get. And that's the reality of Budapest. But that's led to a mythology today that many people have said, if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, Russia wouldn't be doing any of this. They would have that deterrence. And so there are people out there that continue to build upon this thought. The intelligence that the Russian ambassador speaks of came from the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. Now, there's a couple things here. Having worked in intelligence at its strategic level, intelligence services don't come out and give briefings of this nature normally. Because that information is usually highly classified. The sources and methods used to collect it are very sensitive. You don't want to give them away. And your job isn't to brief the public or brief the world. Your job is to brief the Russian leadership. So when a decision was made that the Russians are going to say this information comes from the intelligence service, there's a political reason behind it, which the Russians are putting people on notice. Basically saying, we're aware that conversations are happening at a certain level about the potential of taking, for instance, a French, I forget what, a TN-75, basically it's a low-yield nuclear warhead that the French use on their missiles, and providing those components to the Ukrainians to put them on the Flamingo, turning the Flamingo into a long-range nuclear strike capability. This isn't an official decision made by the French government or the British government. This is lower-level stuff, but the Russians are trying to nip this thing in the bud, saying we're aware that conversations of this nature have taken place. And, Dmitry Medvedev came out and basically said this will be the end of France and the United Kingdom and Ukraine. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. If this happens, you all will die. And that was the purpose of it, to put the marker on the table saying this ain't a game. We're not going to sit here and let this thing mature.
Just before we go and changing the subject radically, do we have a handle on what happened off the coast of Cuba yesterday, where the Cuban either military or Coast Guard killed 4 people in a boat who apparently were Americans?
I mean, this is what I've taken away reading the sources. First of all, in Cuba today, there's a Cuban-American population, a community that is virulently anti-communist Cuba. And, these are people whose relatives fled Batista, the former pro-American dictator who was overthrown by Fidel Castro. These are people linked to the mafia who had made money off the prostitution and the casinos. They're not good people, but they came to the United States to live in freedom. And they've been anti-communist ever since. These are the people that provided thousands of fighters for the Bay of Pigs who were, working for the CIA. And these are the people that have been playing CIA stupid games for a long time against Cuba. And so now they have Marco Rubio, their boy, literally a Cuban American, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, playing stupid games with Cuba, talking tough. And we've seen this before. We've seen Cuban Americans get this sense of self-empowerment. That Cuba's the weak bad guy and we're going to go in and we're going to do things. And what I think happened is you got a boatload of of Cuban Americans who were going in to make a point and sail around and maybe take pictures and posture and say, look how weak Cuba is. And they ran into the wrong people. They fired shots and they paid the ultimate price. That's my take on what happened.
Well, Scotty, thank you very much. Double duty this week and deeply appreciated. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. If there is an attack on Iran, we'll come to you immediately. Thank you, Scott.
Okay, thanks. Have a good day.
You too. All the best. Coming up later today at 12 noon, lies the Israelis told President Trump. Who else? Max Blumenthal. At 1 o'clock, Colonel Douglas McGregor. At 2 o'clock, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. At 3 o'clock, our old pal, Chief Dennis Fritz. Justin Napolitano for Judging Freedom.